cambiar vidas,
change lives,
change organizations,
change
दुनिया में
organizations,
बदलाव.
Change the world.
It is, for me, a great pleasure and a privilege to speak to this distinguished group. I made my first visit to Taiwan more than 50 years ago. Indeed, it was before some of you in this room were even born. And since then, I've returned many times. In the course of that, have made many friends, some of whom are in the room today, and it was a great pleasure for me to see them again. My talk today, as you see on the chart there, is Energy, the Good News. I'm going to focus on some of the game changers that are developing these last few years and making a real difference in the American energy picture. And as these game changers evolve and mature, they're making a real difference in the American economy and American security. I'll have a special focus today on American security. Every American president, since President Eisenhower, has stated that an increased dependence on foreign oil leads to a dangerous decrease in America's national security. And every president has promised to break our dependence on the foreign supplies of oil. In fact, here is what they said. Eisenhower said we should not be importing more than 20%. Anything over 20% endangers our security. Richard Nixon said we're going to be independent of foreign oil by 1980. President Carter called our dependence on foreign oil the moral equivalent of war. President Clinton called it a national security issue. And President Bush, the second President Bush, said the United States is addicted to oil. So there's been a bipartisan consensus these last 60 years to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. The presidents for the last 60 years have promised to do so. So how well have they made out on these promises? This gives you some clue to that. This is the trade balance. You see that little modest little surplus on the top there and the huge deficit on the bottom. More than half of our deficit, our trade deficit, more than $400 billion is a result of our dependence on foreign oil, our imports of foreign oil. So that gives you some clue as to what our problems are. So the economic impact of this trade imbalance is certainly an economic problem, but it is also a national security problem, which is what I will focus on today. For when you consider where is this money going, primarily to Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. In sum, oil dependence in the United States is both an economic and a national security problem, and it has been recognized by every president since President Eisenhower. So why haven't we been able to solve this problem? Fundamentally, during that period, we have not funded R&D adequately, and the R&D which is already successful are going to take decades to reach a significant scale. I'm going to talk about both of those issues today. In particular, the solution involves the development of new technologies which traditionally have been dramatically underfunded. And even the technologies that have been developed will take decades to reach the scale needed to make a real difference. So I'm going to start off by discussing R&D funding. Now, some of you who know me know that I'm a technology wonk. So you might think I'm just simply partial to R&D. But let's look at a few facts, which I will draw on from a National Academy of Engineering report that was done in 2008. This chart shows very clearly that of the US budget of $4 trillion, health is 22% of that, the Department of Defense is about 20% of that, and energy is less than 1%. Or we might compare energy R&D spending to R&D spending in other departments. Picking out the key numbers there, the R&D spending in DOD for 2008 was $77 billion, for health was $28 billion, and for energy R&D, less than $2 billion. So these two charts make clear just how relatively insignificant is our government's effort to develop and deploy new energy systems. In fact, the spending on energy R&D actually reached a high in the late 70s under President Jimmy Carter and has been decreasing since then. In sum, energy R&D spending of the United States government has been small and sporadic with a downward trend since 1981. But, we're in the business school here, and some of my colleagues, particularly in the business school, argue this doesn't have to be done by the government. It will be done by industry. Let market forces solve the problem. Well, I think that's a good idea. But let's take a look at how well the market forces have done on this problem. This chart may be a little hard to read from where you are, but I'll read you the key numbers here. Pharmaceutical industry spends 18% of its sales on research and development. Even the stodgy automobile industry spends more than 2% of its sales on R&D. But the energy industry in 2008 spent less than 1/3 of 1% of its sales on R&D. So much for market forces solving the problem. The reason for this, of course, is that industry is reluctant to make investments in R&D that has a long-term payoff. That is the problem here, exactly. The automobile industry's 2% is on developments that will have a relatively short-term payoff. Well, this is a pretty dismal picture, but my talk is supposed to be about the good news in energy. And part of that good news is that we have already started to turn around that dismal picture on R&D spending. Beginning in 2009, the Obama administration reversed the decline in spending on energy R&D, and most notably, they created something called ARPA-E for energy, which is working to emulate DARPA, ARPA for the Defense Department, in the development of breakthrough technologies, and I believe it's off to a very promising start. Besides funding potentially game-changing technologies, they've held an energy R&D summit every year where the leading researchers in this dynamic field exchange ideas and form joint ventures. The last such summit, I should say, was held just 2 months ago. But this is only R&D. How do we get these new developments up to scale? To make a difference in the problems I've described to you, we have to get them up to scale. The administration has used several $billions of stimulus funds to underwrite new industrial manufacturing plants for solar systems, for example, to accelerate the date by which solar energy will be cost competitive with coal-fired electric plants. But this has had some failures, which I will have more to say about later in my talk. But as a result of these initiatives, as well as several important developments in industry, I believe that we have or are developing the resources and the technology that have the potential to break our heavy dependence on oil sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. To set a baseline for my discussion, I will show you a chart of the different sources of energy today in the United States. These charts show that not only are Americans addicted to oil, as President Bush has said, but that fossil fuels in general are the source for 86% of our energy. So we not only have a security problem, we have an environmental problem as well. We need to substantially reduce our use of foreign oil at the same time we're reducing our CO2 emissions. And even though the United States has ample low-cost coal, we have actually been decreasing the use of coal this past decade and plan to continue that trend in order to reduce global CO2 emissions. So we face a double barrel challenge, the need to develop alternative fuels to replace coal, as well as alternative fuels to replace oil. In meeting these challenges, I see 4 potential game changers. 3 of them are positive, and 1 of them is negative. Shale gas, which Harry's already referred to, is already in production and at scale. I'll have more to say about that. Plug-in hybrids, just entering production, should reach scale in about 10 years. Biomass in R&D, possibly at scale in 10 years. And the 4th game changer is Fukushima. And this is the negative game changer because it's probably the end of the nuclear renaissance, at least in the United States. The Fukushima disaster has put a pause to the so-called nuclear renaissance in the United States, and it has raised serious questions about the safety of nuclear power, even in Japan and Korea, where prior to Fukushima had widespread public acceptance of nuclear power. I'm going to organize my discussion today by separating the 2 major uses of energy, transportation and electric production. First, transportation. The global automobile industry, stimulated by the American government establishment of CAFE standards, has made dramatic improvements in efficiencies this past decade, and even more dramatic improvements are coming. The next chart shows an estimate by the American Academy of Engineering on how fuel-efficient cars will grow in importance the next 2 decades. This chart indicates that in a decade, about 50% of new cars sold will be of design substantially more efficient than present cars. These improvements have already started to take hold. There are already more than 1 million hybrids in the United States, and that plus the improvements in the total fleet brought about by CAFE standards have actually led to a 13 million gallon decrease in gasoline consumption in the United States last year. This is only a small percentage of the gasoline used in the United States, but it is the first decrease since the ending of World War II. So the trend is good. The question is, what can be done to accelerate this good trend? Major new efficiencies will come from plug-in hybrids, just now reaching the market. Many experts estimate that plug-ins will achieve 100 miles per gallon fuel efficiencies, but that is obviously dependent on the driving patterns of the user. I'll give you one example. 2 months ago, I bought a plug-in Prius. I've been driving these past 2 months, and I am getting more than 100 miles per gallon. But it's hard to put a mileage per gallon on a plug-in hybrid because it's very dependent on the driving patterns of the owner. In my case, I drive typically less than 20 miles a day, and that's ideal for the use of a plug-in car. As the number of plug-in hybrids gradually increase, there will be a gradual decrease in the demand for gas. But these improvements, I must say, will be slow to kick in. 1 million hybrids may seem like a lot, but they represent less than 1% of the 250 million cars in the United States. So this favorable trend could be accelerated if costs for plug-ins go down, which will lead to the demand going up. That depends on significant improvements in battery efficiency, which is the goal of several of the R&D programs of this ARPA-E organization that I was talking to you about. So this is a good news story, but car efficiencies, while necessary, are not sufficient. How about fuel? Can we replace oil-based fuel with biomass-based fuel? This is the second potential game changer that I've talked about. Already, existing technology produces ethanol from corn or from sugarcane. In fact, in Brazil, 40% of the auto fuel already comes from ethanol made from sugar. But corn and sugar are valuable food crops, and this is guaranteed to keep the cost of ethanol high if it's derived from either corn or sugar. The real potential for biomass is fuel from cellulose. That'd be agricultural waste, waste paper, scrap wood, sawdust, and grasses. There is a huge supply of low-cost feedstock. And the technology to convert this into fuel has already been demonstrated, but it is not yet at cost and not yet at scale. My own judgment is that cellulosic biofuel will become cost-effective and be operating at a significant scale in less than 10 years from now. It'll become cost-effective probably in 3 or 4 or 5 years, and at scale in about 10 years. My bottom line then for transportation is that car efficiencies have more than offset the demand, will more than offset the increased demand for fuel in the last few years, and in the next 5 years will lead to a continuing decrease in gas consumption. And the cellulosic biomass could begin to be a significant substitute fuel in the period 5 to 10 years from now. And more importantly, could be cost competitive and at a meaningful scale by 10 years from now. So my optimism in the transportation field depends on the rapid scale up of biofuel and continued improvements in fuel efficiencies. But of course, if the electric cars and the plug-in hybrids drive fuel efficiency, there will be a concomitant increase in the demand for electricity. The power for the electric cars has to come from somewhere, and it's coming from, so it will cause an increased demand for electricity. So that takes me to the second half of my talk, which has to do with the production of electricity. I'm going to start off with some facts. In some industrial nations, nuclear power is the primary source of electricity. That's true in Japan, Korea, and in France, for example. Other nations have indicated they plan to turn to nuclear power in the near future as a major source of electricity. The good news is that if this occurs, it would lead to dramatically decreased emissions of CO2. The bad news is that it could substantially complicate the global effort to control nuclear proliferation. The most obvious example of the proliferation problem is North Korea, which used a nuclear power program as a cover for a nuclear bomb program. And it seems like Iran might be following North Korea's suit. The United States has a large number of nuclear power plants, and at one time was headed in the same direction as Japan, Korea, and France. But after the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident several decades ago, we stopped building nuclear reactors. With the growing concern of climate change this past decade, the U.S. reconsidered its self-imposed moratorium on nuclear power, and several new permits were granted. Many in the United States talked about a nuclear renaissance in the United States, but in the wake of Fukushima, the American nuclear renaissance is on hold. In the meantime, we are generating 40% of our electricity from coal-fired plants. Coal is abundant and cheap in the United States, but it is also the greatest source of CO2 emissions. As a consequence, we have substantially reduced our coal plants this past decade from 55% to 40%. That's a big change in just 10 years. In the same spirit, we have reduced our oil generation of electricity from 15% down to 1%. It's almost gone away now. During this same period, hydro and nuclear power have remained constant at about 15%. And after all the years of effort and public attention, only 1% of our electricity comes from wind and solar. So nearly all the decrease in coal and oil use for electricity generation is the result of the substantial increase in gas-fired electricity and cogenerator plants. So based on these facts, I'm now going to offer you some opinions. The first is we should make it a national priority to replace coal plants because they are a major contributor to carbon emissions. New hydro is very unlikely to be developed in the United States. There will be no Three Gorges project in the United States. Solar and wind will eventually become significant, but will be very slow to reach a significant scale. We have three options then for earlier change. Natural gas, which is available, low cost, and much cleaner than coal or oil, but still, I must say, a source of CO2. Nuclear, which has substantial public resistance, and we can get more efficiencies in the use of electricity, which is one of the things you will be talking about at this symposium today. In my opinion, we should move vigorously on all three of those fronts. Efficiencies, light bulbs, efficient houses, efficient office buildings are already underway, and I am optimistic about the future there. This is a chart showing you how we expect the left side forecast over the next 2 decades. There will be about a 1/3 increase in electricity demand as our population and economy grow, especially as the number of electric cars and plug-in hybrids increase. But if we continue to pursue building efficiencies, shown on the right-hand side of the chart, we should be able to offset increased energy demand with increased efficiencies. So I see this as about a break-even. Just all of the efficiencies we're talking about today will allow us to keep up with the increasing demand. But how can we do better than that so that we can actually decrease our use of coal plants? The alternative fuels, solar and wind, have been developed, but are still too expensive. I think it will take at least 5 years to get the costs down to grid parity, that is, so the electricity is comparable to other sources of energy on the grid. And more importantly than that, even at that time, it will not be to scale. It will take 10 to 20 years to go from 1% to 10% of our grid electricity. So in sum, alternative fuels are potentially important, but still small and will be very slow to play a significant role. The primary reason that solar is so slow to kick in is it still cannot compete economically with other forms of electricity generation. I'm going to show you something which is familiar to industrial engineers, but called the learning curve. And this is the learning curve now on the cost reduction of silicon solar. These are experimental data dating back for the last 30 years on how the costs have gone down. It shows that solar panels are on a 22% learning curve. That is, to get a 22% decrease in manufacturing costs requires a doubling of production. So we have a classic chicken and egg problem. Solar is too expensive to justify increasing the production, but unless the production is increased, the cost will not go down. This explains why our Secretary of Energy, Steve Chu, has undertaken a government program to provide industry with incentives to accelerate the production of solar energy. This incentive program has generally gone well, but unfortunately, one program, namely Solyndra, laid a giant egg, a giant political egg, I must say. It went bankrupt 2 years after the government guaranteed a $400 million loan on their manufacturing plant, which is now sitting empty over in Fremont. The biggest game changer in the generation of electricity this past decade has been the aggressive production of shale gas. Shale gas truly is a game changer. It's a huge resource in the United States. Some have called us the Saudi Arabia of gas, with more than a century's supply. The technology is mature. It is developed in the United States more than 10 years ago, and its success has already greatly exceeded anyone's expectations. And it's already at scale. We went from 10% to 20% of the total U.S. production in just the 10-year period. And we've gone from importer of natural gas to exporter of natural gas. I think perhaps most interestingly, it is demonstrated to be cost effective. It's already resulted in lower prices for gas, which have had a ripple effect on other sources of energy. Incidentally, the revolution is not just in shale gas. The New York Times, about 3 months ago, did a feature article on the new sources of gas and oil now being developed. And this is a map they showed, showing the different places in the world and the different new forms of energy. And from the map, you can see that shale gas is the most important new fuel in the United States, and oil sands are the most important source of new fuel in Canada. So what is a plausible strategy for electricity in the United States? We will continue to push on efficiencies. The goal here is to at least hold even with increasing demand. We should put a high priority on U.S. natural gas to replace the remaining use of oil in electricity generation. And as alternative fuels become cost competitive, start bringing them up to scale and gradually replace the coal-fired plants. This is a viable plan, but it will kick in slowly because of the long time for solar and wind power to reach a significant scale. Could we accelerate it by building a new generation of nuclear plants? I'm now coming to that dread word, nuclear. This is very likely to happen. Whatever we do in the United States, it's very likely to happen in China, in India, and possibly Korea, where there's been good public acceptance of nuclear power. A few years ago, many were producing this global nuclear renaissance in the United States, but as I've already told you, that nuclear renaissance now seems to be on a hold here in the United States. There is research in the United States on adapting our naval reactors, which have had such a sterling safety record, adapting them for civil applications. Proponents propose that these new civil reactors would be significantly smaller than the reactors in use today and would be built in modules. And so they received the name Small Modular Reactors, or SMRs. And there's great interest in the United States on trying to develop those. If the SMR were to be accepted, it would replace the coal-fired plants faster than solar and wind and with no carbon dioxide emissions. If not, our plan should be to gradually replace coal-fired plants with natural gas cogeneration plants. This strategy could lead to a long-term decrease in carbon dioxide emissions in the U.S. and worldwide, and it would lead to a substantial increase in energy security for the United States. As those same processes and technologies were induced globally, they could lead to lower oil prices and decreased coercive power of OPEC. Well, this is an optimistic forecast, but I'm going to close on saying what could go wrong with that forecast, and also what could go right with that forecast, what could go better than I'm suggesting. First of all, what could go wrong with it? These are what I would call the crows. What crows could develop which would really foul up the forecast I've made? The first and biggest one is our environmental concerns could decrease or stop the shale gas drilling. That would be huge if it happened, because very much of the strategy I've described to you here depended on the continuing increase in shale gas production. Secondly, plug-in hybrid costs could remain too high for general use. I had to pay a premium to buy my plug-in Prius, and I did it, but I think that's going to be deterrent to most people actually accepting them. But as I told you before, if we get the battery costs down, then we might find that these could be at competitive costs as well. A third thing that could go wrong is that cellulosic fuel could fall into what the venture capitalists here in Silicon Valley call the valley of death. That's the valley between developing something and bringing it up to scale in production. And that's a difficult valley to get over, and we might get stuck in that valley of death. And finally, we might lack the political will to carry out hard programs such as the small modular reactors. Well, those are all the downsides. Those are the things that could go wrong. What are the things that could go right? What are the bluebirds here? What are the good things that could happen? We could reach grid parity sooner than I predicted with solar, particularly if these stimulus plans kick in. We could get a renewable 20% of electricity in 20 years instead of the 10% which I forecast. That would be good. Related to that one, DARPA could make a battery breakthrough, and electric cars to become a significant market sooner than I had forecast. We could use natural gas for transportation. I talked about biomass for transportation, but you could use natural gas for transportation. In fact, it's already being used by some heavy-duty trucks in the United States today. And it's much cheaper source of energy than gasoline. There's a little bit of problem. You don't find any filling stations along the highway. But and it also costs a certain front-end investment to adapt your engine for it. But that could develop. And the government could really surprise me and adopt a carbon pricing policy. All of those can make a positive difference. My strategy and forecast do not assume any of them. I'm going to end my talk then on a high note, that on balance, I believe the things that could go right, the bluebirds, are more likely than the things that could go wrong. Thank you very much. I'm giving you secondhand information now. This is not information I developed myself. But I've been told that there are likely substantial sources of shale gas in China, for example. And my colleague, George Shultz, visited just a few months ago and talked with the incoming president, who expressed very high interest, very good knowledge of the subject and very high interest in China aggressively developing its shale gas, and talked about a transfer of technology from the United States for that purpose. Beyond that, there's probably substantial shale gas resources in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Ukraine. This has not only an economic impact on those two countries, but a big political impact, since they are dependent on their natural gas from Russia, and it's been a continual source of political tension between Poland and Ukraine on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. So yes, there is that potential. All of the countries I mentioned, Ukraine, Poland, and China, are in active discussions with the United States companies that are drilling this so-called fracturing technique or fracking technique to talk about transfer of technology for that purpose. Let me comment on the more general issue of the environmental problems, both real and perceived, on fracturing or fracking as a means of extracting gas. There are robust environmental groups in the United States that are opposing the continuing drilling in western Pennsylvania in particular. There's been a lot of, and other parts of the United States there's been no problem at all. I think it's dependent largely on how careful the drillers themselves have been in paying attention to environmental issues and as opposed to just doing the cheapest and quickest approach to getting the gas out. So the environmental issue is a real one. France and Germany, I think it's unlikely, even though they may have natural gas supplies, I think it's unnatural they will pursue them because of the strength of the environmental movements in those two countries. But France already has issued a law saying that the fracking may not be used for developing gas. Of course, France is almost completely dependent on nuclear power for its electricity, so it doesn't have quite the same need for it. If you remember, the first what can go wrong that I described was there could be an upsurging of the environmental resistance in the United States. My forecast, that will not happen unless there's some kind of an accident or an incident which draws attention to the problem. But that could happen. That could happen. So that would be the big worry there. If there could be a 3 Mile Island incident in the fracking industry, something comparable to 3 Mile Island, that's what we have to worry about there. I will point out I'm standing here in the business school, which is the sacred grounds of free market forces solving all of our problems. Free market forces are not solving, they're leading to the problem you described about. What has led to significant improvements in efficiencies in the United States, at least, have been government-imposed regulations, which we call CAFE. I forget what that acronym stands for, but it's the last two. FE stands for fuel efficiency, but it's government-regulated fuel efficiency, where they require that an automobile manufacturer has to achieve certain average miles per gallon over its whole fleet. And each time there's been an increase in CAFE, there's been a scream from the automobile industry, this can't be done, it's going to cause enormous increases in expenses, the public won't like it. So, and each time they've done it, and it's worked out just fine. The most recent one is, and those have led more than anything, I think, to automobile manufacturers developing the technology which allows them to get more efficiency. It's not going to happen from market forces. It's not going to happen from customer demand. It's happening from government regulation. So I'm afraid the floor under me is going to open up and I'm going to be pulled down for having said that, but that's my view of it. In the area of car efficiencies, it's been almost entirely because of the government mandates in the United States. I think we have essentially unlimited supplies of shale gas for the foreseeable future, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. And the big impediment, and it can be extracted at very economic prices. The big impediment, as I mentioned, was regulation. But even if we do all of this, the shale gas still has a problem with CO2 emissions. It's twice as good as coal, but it still has substantial carbon emissions. So it's not a panacea. And in my talk, I put it as the fallback position if these other measures don't pan out. If we can move faster with the alternative energies, with solar or wind, that's a more desirable option from a CO2 point of view. But I'm a big fan of solar energy, but I find it hard to be optimistic that it's going to develop much faster than I've described. The one big hope of giving solar energy a huge boost was when our Secretary of Energy, Steve Chu, poured government money into trying to accelerate the production of it. And unfortunately, one of those plants in which he put in the money tanked. It went bankrupt. And that has given a bad name to the whole idea of the government trying to stimulate, accelerate this production. So I don't see any real prospect of solar energy increasing at a faster rate than it has been in the past, essentially losing that stimulus which Secretary Chu tried to apply to it. So it's going to be a slow developer. And if you look at that learning curve that I showed you, it says that it's going to take 5 years to get down to grid parity, but that doesn't even take account of the fact that natural gas is continuing to come down in price. So the target of grid parity is a moving target. Grid parity cost is going to get harder and harder to reach as the cost of natural gas goes down. So competing, natural gas has 3 negatives associated with it. It does have carbon dioxide emissions, I mentioned that. Secondly, it's the enemy of alternative energy sources. It makes it harder for solar to reach grid parity, and it's also the enemy of nuclear power. Because nuclear power, which used to be considered a cheap source of electricity, if you set aside the safety and security problems, it's a cheap source of electricity. But because of all the regulations built up in the United States, it's no longer a cheap source of electricity. Natural gas is cheaper now than solar. So natural gas is also an enemy of the nuclear renaissance. I've read what people have written, and on both sides of the argument. One side saying that it is causing water pollution. This is in particular in Pennsylvania where the charges are being made, where people who live in that neighborhood are saying it's getting into their water supply. And the drilling companies who say that can't happen, we have this pipe totally encased, the water couldn't get out. I don't know what the truth is in that, between those two arguments. I suspect that the truth is that if the drilling is done properly, the water cannot get out. But it's certainly easy to believe that some particular driller might have been sloppy in his techniques, and it is getting up. But that is a big issue. If indeed the fracking is going to contaminate the water supply, that's a huge barrier to it moving forward. Everything I've been able to read from the engineers who have looked at this said that does not have to be the case. You can do this in such a way that it will not contaminate the water supply. There are other issues which are environmental issues which are almost fundamental in what's being done, which is the people who live in the area are annoyed by all the trucks that are driving into their area. And I mean, all of the activity which comes, all of the people and transportation trucks that come from the activity. And that's just a fact of life. That is certainly a fact. But I think the contamination of water is a problem that can be dealt with by proper techniques. This issue is simply one manifestation of the political gridlock which the United States finds itself in today, not just on energy, but in many other issues. But in particular, the political gridlock we face in the United States today has prevented us from moving forward in energy policy. We have a president and administration which is completely committed to this idea and is willing to move forward with such, but we have a Congress which is opposing it. And the president made some bold moves in his first year or so, but he's backed away from them in the last couple of years because he wants to avoid the political fights. So as a consequence, we are now paralyzed, I think, with moving forward with a significant energy policy. One manifestation of that is that we have not been able to do what most economists tell us is necessary here, which is to get some kind of a way of putting a cost, of putting a price on carbon. That if you could do that, then you could let market forces work in your direction, work in favor of what we're trying to do. But it has now become a dirty word in the US Congress. Anybody talks about carbon pricing, carbon taxing is the word that they use. No, taxes are bad, so carbon taxes is bad. So we're completely paralyzed on that point right now. I'm sorry to report. I have no good news to offer you in that category. So my title might have been Energy, the Good News, but one thing that's not good news is our ability in the United States to get a meaningful energy policy. The question was, would a change of government affect that policy? And the answer is, I don't know. If President Obama were reelected, you have a president who really would like to do that. But you have to also say what happens to the Congress. If he ends up with a hostile Congress, he's not going to be able to do it, I think. On the other hand, if President Romney were elected, if the new president would be Romney, I don't know where he stands on this issue. I know what he said during the primaries, but he was catering to a conservative audience there. Not conservative in the energy sense, conservative in the political sense. So it may be that he would actually move forward in this field. And if he did, he would have far better chance of success because it's what we call the Nixon going to China problem. If a Democratic president had tried to form relations with China, he would have been hooted down in the Congress. But a Republican president, namely Nixon, did it. He got the support of his own party, plus the Democrats who wanted to do it anyway. So in that same phenomenon could happen in the energy field. If Romney were to decide to make a significant initiative in the field of energy, like, for example, having an energy policy, like having a carbon tax, for example, he could probably get it through. But I have no way of knowing what his view on this, because if you base it on what he said in the primaries, it's not encouraging. But then if you base Nixon's view on China on what he said in primary, it would not have been encouraging either. So maybe there's a possibility for a breakthrough here. Who knows? It's in a way, it is the ideal solution for the United States, because we got tons of cheap coal. And if we could find a way of capturing and sequestering that carbon, that would be a very clear solution for the United States. And in an earlier version of this talk, I held that out as one of the alternatives. I dropped it because I have not seen any reason to be optimistic or encouraging that's going to really happen. And I've talked to the people who are doing the research at this, at both at Stanford and MIT, and I cannot get any encouragement from them that's really going to happen. It would be an ideal solution for us if we could do it. Well, the small modular reactors are probably the closest to mini nuclear, but I wouldn't really call them mini. They're a couple hundred megawatts or so. So the big commercial nuclear reactors are maybe 5, 10 times that size. So that's why they're called small. But they're not mini or portable nuclear reactors. There have been some research in that field as well. And there have been some, in fact, used in various space explorations, but not in an economical way. So between the minis and the huge reactors, there is this intermediate position of small modular reactors, which I do think has some hope for it. The real impediment to small modular reactors moving forward is mostly just the whole negative baggage that the word nuclear reactors has at all. The people who are advancing the small modular reactors argue that they avoid most of those negative features, both in safety and in security. But they haven't proven the point yet. And in any event, this is not a completely unobjective argument. There's a lot of subjective reaction to nuclear reactors, which anything that is a nuclear reactor, even if it deals with the problems, might not be accepted. The mini nuclear reactors, I haven't seen enough research on that to indicate the likelihood they're going to be attractive, except for very special purpose cases like space reactors and and someplace in the far out wilderness where you don't have any other source of power. Any such international agreement meets some automatic resistance in some circles in the United States. It's part of the political paralysis, political deadlock we're in right now on carbon. So international agreements is right up there with carbon tax as issues which are politically volatile. So I'm not optimistic about our political ability to make political agreement, but I do think that technically our ability to achieve the goals of the Copenhagen are going to be much enhanced by our shale gas. But again, shale gas is only a halfway house in terms of environment. It's about half the carbon emissions of coal, but still a lot of carbon emissions. And in the strategy which I laid out, I saw it as a fallback position if the other zero carbon or low carbon emissions don't come to reality. But it's here and now, and we could move very quickly to replace coal-fired plants with gas-fired plants if we move to do that. But it does not give us the benefits of solar power or nuclear power in terms of carbon emissions. I have long advocated more and better cooperation in this field of energy technology because I see it as a win-win. Win-win-win. It's a win for our country, it's a win for the country we're cooperating with, and it's a win for the whole globe if it involves lower carbon emissions. And I do not think we have the same barriers to cooperation as you find in other technologies which are defense-related, say. So I think there's a good probability of doing this. I mentioned to you, just parenthetically, that when Secretary Schultz was in China a few months ago, he discussed shale gas production with the incoming Chinese president and basically offered, for the U.S. government, offered to share the technology on the grounds that we benefit and the whole world benefits if China can find some way of not building another coal-fired plant every other week, which is what they're doing now. Again, it's a halfway house. Gas is not as good as nuclear or as good as solar, but it's much, much better than the coal. And they're not only burning lots of coal-fired plants now, they're still building them at a very fast rate. So it would be a major step forward for China and for the world if they could stop building coal-fired plants and replace them with gas-fired. That would take something like this cooperation. So I'd be very much in favor of it. And I'm also in favor in the area of solar panels as a way of getting this learning curve down. To the extent we let market forces drive this completely, then shale gas is the enemy of solar and it's the enemy of nuclear. And the economic advantage it has is so great on another one of those, that it might stall solar right where it is now, and it might keep any more nuclear plants from being built in the United States. And that's why, as I indicated, that the Secretary of Energy was trying to accelerate the learning curve in solar so it could be more likely to be competitive, because he would like to see the solar plant. He would like to see more solar electricity in the United States. But absent government support for solar manufacturing efficiencies, then I think it's going to be even slower coming on board than people are now predicting, because it has to compete in the grid. It has to compete with the natural gas, which is getting cheaper every year. Well, thank you. It's been very good to talk to you today. It's been a very stimulating audience.
Cambiar vidas,
Change lives,
change organizations,
change
दुनिया में
organizations,
बदलाव,
Change the world.